In about 1959 or 60, the federal government was a bit concerned about the rate of progress in the mapping of Australia. It had slowed down and there wasn't much happening. The Department of Interior took an interest in this, and in one way or another they set up a division of national mapping. And national mapping then set standards in surveying, cartography, aerial photography, etc. And they allocated work to various states. They allocated work to Western Australia in late 1959, covering those map sheets. Each rectangle can be thought of as a map sheet. They decided that they needed a bit of help and they called on me to become a navigator. I was a trained cartographer working in the field of aerial surveys and mapping, called photogrammetry. I had about 5 years experience, maybe a little bit more, and they said, well, they knew I had an interest in aircraft and aviation, so they said, would you take up this position of assistant navigator? And I said, yes, please. No one was more shocked than me. No one was more pleased than me. But I found myself at the beginning of the bottom of a learning curve, a huge one. And it's all right to be interested in aviation, but to take on a job such as this was just out of this world. The whole of Australia was divided up into map sheets, and one down here gives you an indication of the size. And there's plenty of work to do, and so it was map sheet after map sheet, plus lots of other work in between. There's the 5 sheets fitted into the system, and one of the first things to do was to fly what were called key strips. These were like a skeleton to base the work on. 56,000 square kilometres of land. There was no roads, railways, towns in this district, so you couldn't hang the photography on known mapping positions. Take a photograph and could have fitted here, there, anywhere. And so the nearest thing that the photography could be tied to was the East-West Railway and the towns along the way, or the settlements along the way, Lungana, Hague, Forest, etc. And so by old-fashioned DR navigation, they worked out where the key strips were going to go. When I say they worked it out, I wasn't much help. The Lands Department had a navigator, ex-wartime, and an aerial photographer, ex-wartime. Both had worked in their field after the war, and both were headhunted by the Lands Department. They were good at their job. And so it was a matter of working out where you were, maybe there on the border, South Australia this side, Western Australia that side, fly north, work out where to turn the camera on and take a strip of successive photographs that could be pieced together like so.
There's a series of photographs not out in that area, but you can see how they overlap by quite a large amount, 60%, and covering this area here, it went right up, then across, navigate to the next key strip.
And so we ended up with strips of photography. When they were all joined together, they were 25 feet long, that's 6 to 7 metres in length, north-south. And we also had tie strips at 27, 28, 29 and 30 degrees south. That became the framework for the job. Exactly where it was in Western Australia, precisely where it was a bit unknown. We had to hire a hall to lay all that out and then start work on deciding where latitudes and longitudes were, etc. And so if we think of this map sheet up the top, it was 90 nautical miles east-west, 60 nautical miles north-south, and there was 5 of them, so this is only just the one. And there were the 3 key strips, the north-south photography related to that particular map sheet. And so each of the 5 map sheets had their own key strips. On the floor of the hall, we worked out where we had to cross those flight strips, key strips, in an east-west direction. And so the first run would have flown along that line there, and coverage of aerial photography is a bit like mowing a lawn. You would move from one end to another of the first run, turn and come back in the opposite direction, parallel to the first one with a certain amount of overlap, about 25%. The standards were set at 25% plus or minus 10%. And so run 2, and on it would go until the entire map sheet was covered. It wasn't as easy as that because you'd get maybe 3 or so runs and cloud would build up, and cloud was a no-no. So you then have to think of going to another map sheet, flying a couple of runs there if it was cloud-free, or come home. Each run took about 35 minutes. There were 18 runs per map sheet, and that was about 11 hours online, 11 hours flying those yellow lines. Sometimes it took 2 hours to get to the start, and an hour or an hour and a half to get home. And so getting to and from the photographic area could take a fairly large part of the day. The aircraft we used was a DC-3, hired from MMA. The Lands Department had a state-of-the-art camera, one of the best in the world, and the aircraft provided by MMA were very well kept. And this aircraft was a freighter which could be converted to aerial photography in a hurry. And so with that and another DC-3, another aircraft, it was possible to have these aircraft available when the weather came good. So you may get a day or 2 days or 3 days warning, the weather's going to be good in Broome, get your act together and be prepared to leave at the drop of a hat. In the aircraft, there was the captain, the first officer, 2 navigators. John Caesar was there, me behind him, and Bruce Melrose was the camera operator. That's us going to work at Forest in 1960 in Mike Lena. We took an engineer out with us. We were there for 3 or 4 weeks, and he did the service on the aircraft on a daily basis. That's John Caesar, and as I've already told you, that's me. The key to successful operation was a drift sight which poked through the floor of the aircraft. It was possible to use these screws here to level it. You could look forward or vertically down, and it was a matter of peeking down here and working out what the drift was and then applying that to the operation for the day. The camera, that was the Zeiss camera, state of the art. This was also a device on which the drift could be measured. So the camera operator and 2 navigators were comparing the drift. This was absolutely necessary to get that straight flight line across the map sheet. Looking through the drift sight, there was a gauge on one end, lubber lines, and you tracked items through there And if they went through on an angle, you rotated the lubber lines, fed off the drift, compared it with others, and therefore laid it off. The photograph covered the field of view of the drift site, and in nil wind conditions, the camera would be aligned to the aircraft, and so would the drift site. If the wind was from the north, the aircraft would be angled by the drift angle, as you can see there. The camera would be rotated so that it tracks over the ground in a squarish fashion, and the drift site would be aligned with it. And so that would be set up for an eastbound track. Photography was overlapping, as mentioned earlier, when I displayed these overlapping images. They looked like that, and that's what I joined together. Second aircraft that or DC-3 that MMA had set up was a passenger aircraft, and with a quick change, it could be converted into a survey aircraft. There we are in seats and seat belts. This was an aluminium box that went over the station for the camera operator. If that box wasn't there, he'd be out in the open, and it took a fair bit to get the cabin warm. This framework here was to contain oxygen bottles, which fed people in the aircraft for high altitude work. Above 10,000 feet, we're on oxygen. For a DC-3, we didn't go much below 3,000 feet, and we went up to over 20,000 feet. Yeah, we're pushing things at 20,000 feet. No turbulence at 20,000 feet. You get the turbulence down lower. So it was always pretty smooth flying once you got up there. Things weren't always that good. That's a photograph of Bruce in the cabin area of Mike Lima. And things were pretty tough in those days. There's the oxygen bottle supplying the mask, which we would wear from 10,000 feet up to our operating altitude, 20,000 feet, and we take it off at about 12,000 feet on the way down. That was the camera set into the floor of the aircraft, so operating it was a back-braking arrangement where you had to lean over pretty well the whole day to make sure it was operating. We often spent over 8 hours in the air and online on photography for 5 hours, very often. There are a couple of selfies which I took before the word had been invented. And that's the oxygen mask. It was called the demand system, where the oxygen was supplied only when you were breathing in. It wasn't being wasted. We also used an Avro Anson for low-level work. We were concerned about the quality of photography, and image movement was a problem. The camera was, I think, limited to about 300ths of a second. And so a DC-3 below about 3,000 feet would have image movement which could be classed as degrading the quality. Whereas the Avro Anson at 1,200, 1,500, 3,000 feet would or might have image movement of much, much less if it was travelling at about 80 or 90 knots. The setup was that we had a one-pilot operation, 2 navigators and a camera operator. 1963, I think they finished flying Ansons. Jimmy Woods gave it away mid-63. We did a mountain of work, not only map sheets, but all sorts of other things. I'll mention those in a couple of minutes. But we did the Norwest Cape very low frequency radio base when they were thinking of developing it. And on the way home, we dropped an engine in an Avro Anson, you can't fly an Anson on one engine, so the pilot, Len Morley, had to keep the engine going at 1600 RPM. Was just enough to keep us airborne. The alternative was to land in the bush, which none of us wanted to do. Everyone in the crew, apart from me, had been involved with Avro Ansons, and they all knew what was wrong. Everyone wanted to help. What about this? What about that? What about something else? Turned out it had dropped a valve or two, and it caused quite a bit of damage. MMA was very good. They had the network throughout the northwest, and an engineer with the replacement parts was there overnight, and by, let's say, lunchtime the next day, the aeroplane was ready for flight again to come back to Perth. These are some of the types of photography we did. I've already discussed map sheets. We did forestry reserves, forestry patterns, looking at the growth, rate of growth, agricultural department, main roads, highways out in the country, planning for city and country towns, catchment areas for water and the development of culverts and that sort of thing, coastal studies, and mining leases. As far as the catchment areas went, if they were developing a railway line, they would want to find out the river that flows through here will need a bridge or a culvert. How big is the catchment? It may be a few square kilometres, it may be 100 square kilometres. What's the average rainfall for the year, and what's the maximum rainfall in a 24-hour period? What will the runoff likely be? What factor can we apply for seepage and drainage? How much water is going to pass this point in 24 hours under adverse conditions? Let's design half a dozen culverts or a bridge. So that was the sort of thing that the photography was used for. Coastal studies, one interesting aspect of that was where we photographed the coast between Lancelin and Esperance. We were looking for naughty people who were building shacks, or we weren't, we were photographing it so that government departments could look for these naughty people. And the pilots loved this because we weren't taking stereoscopic photography, we were just taking photography. And so you might take a photograph, if it was a bay, you might say 45 degrees right, and the pilot would reef the aircraft around, put it vertical again for the next exposure, and then 10 degrees left, away you go again. These pilots were used to taking off, flying between Perth and Gerald, rate one turns, looking after the passengers, and to get into one of their aircraft and start flying, hand flying it with lots of bank. They thought it was marvellous. We had to slow them down actually because they used to take advantage of us. Very quickly we used those sort of instruments within the Lands Department. That was one of the very early instruments, and that was one of the workhorses. These have been replaced by computer screens these days. So you've got a mouse, and you've got a screen, and you think of something and it can be done. I may talk about what can be done later on. But it's fairly limited. That was drawn on the table out here with ink in the system. Some photos of WA. We've seen that one before. Wyndham town site. That was the meatworks up there, and the jetty was there, and the Kalama on the bottom around about there, the Bastion Mountains. That was the town site, the old town site of Broome. We spent many days, many nights in that room up the top there. It was a large room. It probably, from memory, had about 7 or 8 beds in it. And so we would just move in, put our bag under a bed, and that was home for maybe a week or so. a mosquito net over the top, no air conditioning, and that was it. Pretty rough stuff. I should just spend a couple of minutes talking about this. While we were in Kalgoorlie, we heard this Oster operating across the Nullarbor, stopping at various places. We got to our hotel in Kalgoorlie one evening, and normally we were the only people in the dining room, but there was a couple, two people at a table near us. We heard them talking about aeroplanes and vice versa. So next thing we were talking to each other. So we had dinner for 2 nights with these people. So then we said, okay, see you later, nice meeting you. We came to Perth and they carried on with their around Australia flight. We spent about a week or just over a week at Perth, jobbing Broome, Derby and Wyndham. Let's get going. So we take off for Broome, and when we get on final approach for Broome, what should be in front of us but this aircraft? Where are you going to stay? Continental Hotel. So we had dinner for 2 nights with them in Broome. Where are you going next? Well, we've got some work to do in Wyndham. Oh, we're going to Wyndham too. So we'll stay at the same hotel. So we had dinner with that couple for 5 nights in about 12 at various parts of the state. Most unusual arrangement. Some of the scenery up there was outstanding, and it really blew me away. The only way to describe it was mind-blowing. Coburn Ranges, these vertical faces here, reminded me of the size of Royal Perth Hospital. Every now and then a block of rock would slip off from that. Maybe happened 1,000 years ago. Something as big as Perth Hospital could be on a bit of an angle. That's looking over the wing of the aeroplane from the hatch towards the back of the cabin. The diversion dam, we took aerial photography of the diversion dam for the Ord River and aerial photography working out the capacity of Lake Argyle. All hard work in those days when you compare it to what can happen today. That's it on the ground. Some of the countryside up there can be quite nice. There's nothing in that photograph, but it's just nice. As I said, we had trouble with the pilots every now and then, and they loved low flying. We actually had to take them in hand along the way because they'd, without announcing anything, end up at a very low altitude. And we'd say, listen, we've chartered this aircraft for safe flight between A and B. What are you doing down there? Now, if you're going to do that sort of thing, let us approve it. Now, we're happy in seeing this sort of stuff, but we just don't want to let it happen. Also, they used to fail an engine. We'd be going between Broome and Derby or Perth and Broome or something like that. The next thing you'd be doing some work, and next thing, you think, oh God, what's happening here? So you go up the front and ask, oh, it's just playing a game with the first officer. And we said, no, if you're going to do that, let us know that around about 11 o'clock today, I'm going to fail an engine. Don't let the first officer know, for goodness sake, but just let us know so that we don't get all het up about it. So anyway, we got things sorted out in the end. Just a nice photograph of the Ord River downstream from the dam and a shot out the back of the aircraft from the hatch. Some of the geology up there is unbelievable, and you can't help thinking, what was it like a few million years ago when this geology was being set up? Maybe you've heard of Windgilla Gorge. It occurs in the history books where an Aboriginal took refuge in there and the police took a lot of time to sort him out. This little bit over here is like this here. It's limestone and the watercourse has cut its way through. Geeky Gorge near Fitzroy Crossing, you just wonder at the power of water to do that over a period of time. Most people don't appreciate that Derby Port is a long way from Derby Town. That gravel road would be undoubtedly bitumen by now, and it would have been developed a lot more than that. The mangroves and flooding, tidal flooding. Maybe you remember the Walcott Inlet where they were going to generate tidal power. We took photography of that and we pioneered the use of infrared photography in the state for that purpose, to work out the volume of water that would flow through the narrow neck in 6 hours and convert that to energy. Whitman Gorge, the town grew after the 1960s and there's not much left, just a few houses. That was the mine working, and I remember this gorge, pleasant memories. We overnighted in Whitman Gorge on a Friday night. Saturday was grand final day, and a couple of us wanted to get to Perth for the grand final. So we arranged for a first light departure. We got out to the aerodrome, airborne at first light, and the pilots discussed it with us, and we flew up the valley there in the half light of the dawn, and it really was something else. When we got to the end of the gorge, we climbed out into the sunlight up to 6,000 feet and off home to the footy. Mount Bruce for many years was classed as the highest mountain in Western Australia. It stood out, it was a classic. But someone working in the lands department one day was working on some reciprocal vertical angles from survey data, and he said, I think I found something higher than Mount Bruce. So they did some check calculations, and sure enough, way over in the background here was a hill higher than Mount Bruce, but it was in a range and it didn't stand out anywhere near as good as that. That was called Mount Meharry after a pioneer. Well, this was 2,024 feet high at the top. What they had a lot of problem with was trying to work out what sea level was, because it changed depending which school you went to. Onslow, pretty small outfit. The biggest building in town was the Beaton Creek Hotel. I think the government's got 600, 400 accommodation units up there that they don't know what to do with at the moment. So Onslow's changed a lot. That photo doesn't do justice to some of the cloud formations that we came across. That's Shark Bay, some beautiful scenery. I know I keep on saying beautiful scenery, but it was there. We spent a fair bit of time in Carnarvon, and we spent a day at the whaling station. Our family knew the Moore family quite well, who owned and ran this show. I actually went for my first flight in an aircraft in the Norwest Whaling Company's whale spotter. And so by mentioning Bob Moore's name, or young Bob's name, we were shown over this. As per, most people don't see it. There's Bruce Melrose, our photographer, looking at a couple of whales that have been harpooned and brought in for processing. The whales were towed up a ramp, and then the flensers moved in on them. The ramp took them up to, let's say, the equivalent of first floor. And that's the flenser cutting the whale up. The body was cut into strips. The strips were towed forward through holes in the floor pardon me, and dropped into cookers below where the whale oil was extracted. What was left over after that, plus the bones, were all crunched up for blood and bone. After 2 years of MMA, they were outbid by Ad Astra aerial surveys from the eastern states. We didn't realise the advantages of flying with MMA. With this group, they tried hard, but with 2 pilots and an engineer on the ground, and that's all. It was hard work. So the saviour was going to be this device, this lump under the nose of the aircraft. It was a Doppler navigator. It was going to give us drift. It was going to give us ground speed, items of interest for any navigator, and particularly a navigator on aerial survey work. But it didn't work on a regular basis. That was the readout, but it was correct for about 90% of the time, and then it would just wander off, unfortunately. After a year of dealing with what we might say was second best, MMA didn't tender for the next round, and 2 locals tendered, Murchison Air Charter and Civil Flying Services. The successful tenderer was Murchison Air Charter, and they provided a pretty good service for quite a number of years. Civil Flying Services tendered for the work with the Queen Air, and this was an unusual arrangement. They hadn't done very much preparation, and I was assigned to the test. I had a pro forma, which I was filling in throughout the climb to 20,000 feet. I was noting the time, indicated altitude, outside air temperature, manifold pressure, RPM, all that sort of stuff. And we got to 18,000 feet, and I looked at Alex McDonald, who was the chief pilot with Civils, and I noticed that his earlobes were very red and even a little bit bluish. And I thought, he's in trouble. This could be hypoxia. Then I looked at his fingernails, and the skin under his fingernails was red, bluish as well. And I thought, hello, this is not good at all. We had 2 people on board, a manager from the Lands Department and another pilot from Civils. The manager from the Lands Department was asleep, and the pilot from Civil Flying Services had his mask off and was stretching the lackey band and having a lot of fun as if he was off the air. So I turned to Alex and I said, Alex, it's all over. We're giving this away. And he said, no, we've got 3,000 feet to go. And I said, no, look out the back there. Things aren't too good. And he went, oh, yeah. And so in talking to the Yos, I later confirmed that what I did was quite right and reasonable, but I decided to pressure breathe, in that I would take a breath and force it into my lungs, because if pressure down at sea level was forcing oxygen into my lungs, I was forcing oxygen into my lungs with every second breath, and I was going to be the last one to go out. So we got on the ground, and Civils didn't get the contract. We then moved to an Aero Commander. I only did a couple of jobs in that. Lovely aeroplane, Executive Air West, and you can see there's a slide underneath, and the camera shot through that hole there, and of course the landing and takeoff, that slide would cover the opening. Just a couple of shots of Perth, when we used to have an esplanade and lots of car parking. Not so now. Kalgoorlie, spent a lot of time in Kalgoorlie. Hannon Street, if you go down there and keep heading west, you end up in Perth. Go down Maritata Street, you end up in Boulder. That was the open cut. They hadn't invented the word super pit in those days. And just have a look at the small building here, buildings over here, and the relative size of the open cut. Look at the buildings now and the hole in the ground. It is a super pit, there's no doubt about that. Targets were often placed on the ground on survey points. It wasn't always that we had to find targets, but we did from time to time. pick up targets, and we knew that we were in the right place. And so this is a couple of people who came after us, me, and they were just playing games and saying, there's a target. But these white crosses were placed on survey pegs. Thank you.